We're going to be using the GitHub API to grab users. Now, the GitHub API is really cool to use for demo applications because it gives out some free information. That means we don't have to authenticate to get user information. It makes it really easy to use for demo apps. Here, I'm on developer.github.com, and this is where we can see the API documentation. Scroll down, and here is going to be our core API URL, https api.github.com. And then we can use any of these sections here to grab miscellaneous data. The one we want to use the most is going to be this users section here. And we're going to get all users. The URL for this is /users, which makes this very easy. We're going to open up a new tab, api.github.com/users. Press enter, and this is the JSON that comes back from this API call. We can see that this username is Majombo, defunct. I have no idea how to say that, and it keeps going on and on and on. We want to make sure we don't get too many, so we will also attach a URL parameter for per_page is equal to 10. That means we only get 10 users. This will be the API call we make from our application to get these 10 users. We'll come back over. Angular already has a built-in library to make HTTP calls to an API. Normally, if you're using a JavaScript or jQuery application, you would bring in a library like Axios. Here, we're going to use Angular's HTTP library. We'll go into app module. Since we want to use Angular's HTTP library, we have to go and add it to our app module so that Angular knows we want to use it. Import HTTP client module from Angular common HTTP. And that's where they have placed the HTTP library in the common section. Now we're going to copy this HTTP client module and paste it into imports. Now we have access to the HTTP library. Let's go into app-component.ts and let's test this out. So here under app component, this is where we're going to put everything. We don't even need that title anymore. Constructor. Now the way that these classes work is we're going to have a constructor where we inject everything that's needed for this class. In this case, we need private HTTP client. Press enter and it gets added here. And notice it's HTTP client, not HTTP client module. The module is kind of the entire library that gets imported into Angular. But for the HTTP calls, we just want HTTP client. So we have that here. Now, when our page loads, we want to tell it to go to that GitHub API and use it. So Angular has lifecycle hooks. One on when this component gets initialized is called ng-on-init. So on init, we're going to say this.http since we injected it as a property to this class called http.get. And let's go copy that URL we had right here, api.github.com. So we'll paste that here. And now we are going to get the data from that API call. Angular's HTTP library returns what's called observables. And if you're not familiar with observables, they're kind of the upgrade over promises. Normally, if you're using a promise, you would do .then data, and I'm going to use an ES6 arrow function here. You would console.log the data here. But since we have an observable, we're going to subscribe to it. And the cool thing about observables is that it's data over time. So as this HTTP call starts to emit different values, this subscribed it will automatically get those new values. So instead of polling, like let's say with promises, you would listen every 5 seconds for new data. This happens automatically with observables. We're observing the data stream. All right, so we have this app component. We save that. Let's go to the home page. Oh, we didn't even route link this Angular logo. So we'll click on home here, console. And here, let's clear this. That's a ton of information. Clear it. Here is our 10 users that came back from our GitHub API. Now, while it's great to have this HTTP call directly inside of our component, this isn't the best for scalability because what happens if we want to get these users again on another component, right? So we would have to copy this constructor and this ng-on-init call and put it into our other components because we want to use this in user list component. But then what happens if we have two separate HTTP calls? We want to change per page to 20. Now we'd have to change it in two places. And that doesn't really do well for scalability. Angular has what's called services, and this is where we group together all of our API calls. I'm going to create a service now. Clear this. ng service. I'm going to call mine user service, since this is going to be handling going to grab users. If you wanted, you could call it GitHub user service or just GitHub service. It all depends on your application, but since this is a simple one, we're getting users, I'm just going to call it user service. All right, source app user service. Now the thing about when Angular builds out services, it doesn't add them to modules automatically like it does components. We'll have to do that ourselves. And we'll talk a little bit more about organizational structure towards the end of this course. We'll open this back up. We have our new user service. Let's register this in the top level app module. Services go under providers, user service, and it automatically gets imported from .user.service. All right, now we can start using this user service. Let's define this. Here is the core of a service. We have our constructor where we're going to inject the private HTTP client. And it did the import as well for us from Angular common HTTP. Now we need a couple things, right? We're going to get all users. Get users. And then we're also going to get a single user by their username. And I'm just using this as a placeholder here, get user, and we're going to pass in a username, and we're going to tell TypeScript this is going to be a string. And that is the core of our user service. Now here, let's go over here to our app component. Let's take this HTTP call out of here. We don't need that ng-on-init anymore. We don't need to inject this HTTP client, and we don't need that import anymore here. Our app component is back to being a very simple app component. Totally compartmentalized, doesn't have to worry about any HTTP calls, and we're going to paste this here. Now our get user will be very similar. We're going to copy this, paste this down here, but we're not even going to subscribe to these things inside of our user service. That's going to be handled by the component. We're just going to return each of these HTTP calls. If I can spell return correctly, there we go. And one thing I like to do, we're kind of writing out this URL here twice now. I'm going to say API URL is equal to that. Now I could turn this into template backticks, ES6 template strings, this.api URL per page 20 here, and then same goes for down here, this.api URL slash username, and these are template backticks. And I don't need that per page since we're getting a single user. And that is going to be our user service. Let's take a quick look at this. Instead of at component, the decorator used for components, Angular will use an at injectable decorator to tell us that this class user service is going to be a service. We have injected HTTP client here as a property called HTTP. And then we have get users and get a single user where we pass in a username, which is a string. And these are the two URLs we have. Now we can use this user service. We can inject it into multiple components and use these accordingly. In the next lesson, we're going to use this user service inside of our users user list component to grab the 10 users that we're going to show.